like. In fact, we were just on a call with the CFOs of LeadingAge on a whole slew of compliance-related topics. So, but we wanted to address this request and have my associate Matt Cowles, who is one of our key advisors on the retirement practice, really walk through how 403B works, what to be aware of from an HR perspective and an employer perspective, and have this as an open conversation with questions and answers and what have you. So, without any further ado, Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take the show over here.
Thanks, Rollin, and thank you all for your time this morning. As Rollin said, because it's a small group, we're going to touch on some topics that were of interest, but please ask questions as I go. I love to make this more interactive, and we'll definitely get into a conversation where we'll pivot from just talking about a 403B plan to what's really applicable for all retirement plans. So if you're sitting in a seat and you're thinking we have a 401k, there's still going to be some conversation today that I think is applicable to those plans as well. But as Rollin said, we wanted to start with the 403B first. And I think I can share my screen here. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see the presentation.
Yep, we can see it.
Excellent. Okay, so getting started, I wanted to kind of take a step back and kind of set the stage for our discussion around a 403B, because 403B plans have changed quite a bit over the years. I started in this business, and it's easy for me to remember, it was Y2K. It was a couple of days after Y2K, and I had to actually go to work because the world didn't blow up and computers were still working. And I entered into this business of helping plan sponsors manage their retirement plans, but I've always worked with nonprofit organizations and primarily in the 403B world. So I've seen this 403B evolution for the last 21 years, and Rollin as well, and it's come a long way. But to start off, most plans in the 403B world are covered under ERISA. So following the same ERISA rules and regulations, laws that a 401k plan would. Some organizations are exempt from ERISA, nonprofit organizations, so a governmental entity or a church plan that essentially is not electing to comply with ERISA. So there are exceptions based on organizational status, but there is this small sliver, if you will, of an exception for a 403B plan to be exempt from ERISA as well, even outside of an exempt organization. And again, this kind of goes back to the model that was used years ago. We still see it in the public sector. So like public schools traditionally have this type of setup, but in the private world, most plans are now set up under an ERISA status. But again, looking at it from an historical point of view, if I was to entertain a 403B in a non-ERISA status, essentially there's no employer contribution that can be made. It's a voluntary plan only, so I can allow people to contribute to it. The employer has to have limited involvement. So essentially, I cannot make decisions on investments, on any provider that's being brought to the table in the 403B in terms of the investments or the annuity or the mutual fund contract. Really, all I'm doing is providing a payroll function. So a payroll slot and allowing folks to contribute to this plan using any investment vehicle that they choose. And so it kind of created this kind of the cafeteria style plan where a lot of the product that was being sold in these arrangements was retail annuity or mutual funds. So on the annuity side, you had very expensive annuity products with long extended surrender charge period. So essentially once a investor went in, they'd have a very hard time getting out of those contracts because there would be a very stiff penalty if they came out of that contract early. Sometimes these contracts, these surrender charges were based on contributions going in, so they would never end. And on the mutual fund side, you were dealing with your traditional load. So front end load, back end load type of product on the mutual fund side. So again, retail based product, all individual contracts, not necessarily the most efficient way to run a plan, but how it was done again years ago, and still see some of it today. But the reason why we don't see a lot of it now is because back in 2007, the largest 403B regulations were passed since the inception of the 403B. So it was sweeping changes. And one of the major changes was now all 403B plans were required to have a plan document. So now you, as a non-ERISA 403B, again, not exempt, but a multi-provider non-ERISA 403B plan, now with a plan document requirement, there was now this huge administrative burden on a non-ERISA 403B plan sponsor that wasn't before, and was one of the primary reasons why they did this, was to not have the administrative burden, just to have a plan that they could offer, but be kind of arm's length away. Now this forced them to be involved in the administration of the plan, specifically loans and hardships. And you're doing this over multiple contracts. So you could think, for you guys today, how hard it is to do this just with one provider. Think if you had 5, 10, 15 different 403B providers that you're trying to coordinate within this document and coordinating all these different transactions. So it became very, very difficult to operate a non-ERISA plan with these additional regulations. This also brought 401k and 403B plans closer together. So in the past, before this, 403B plans were not subject to audit regardless of plan size. They had a limited 5,500 filing. But when this was passed, essentially it created similarities in terms of those rules with 403Bs and 401ks. So just like a 401k, a 403B has to file a 5,500 every year. And if it goes over the threshold of number of participants, it's subject to an audit, just like a 401k. So this legislation was sweeping, and again, it changed the environment on the 403B side because it brought 403Bs much closer to 401ks and all of the administration that goes along with it. So, and again, experiencing this as a financial advisor at the time, a lot of non-ERISA multiple provider 403B plan sponsors moved to an ERISA plan. It just made sense, and it created a lot of efficiencies for the sponsor to do that. Now, outside of the non-ERISA ERISA, one of the other unique things about a 403B is it's subject to what's called universal availability rules. So this is not ERISA. This is actually part of the 403B tax code. So it makes it unique to 403Bs versus a 401k. And essentially what this means is if you have a 403B and you're allowing your employees to contribute, you have to essentially allow all of your employees to contribute. That's essentially what universal availability means. So it makes 403Bs more accessible to the 403B plan participants because of universal availability rules. And there's some things that 403B plans gain because of this rule as well that I'm going to talk about. Now, there is certain exceptions that you can exclude employees from your 403B. One of the primary ones that we see is employees who normally work less than 20 hours per week. So this exclusion very commonly is used, so you don't have to include the folks that you hire in a part-time status or maybe a per diem status where you don't expect them to work more than 20 hours per week. So you can exclude those employees. And again, a lot of our plan sponsors on the 403B side utilize this exclusion provision. The other three you see here: students, non-resident alien, and then employees who have access to another qualified plan like a 401k, 403B, or 457 plan. So again, very narrow, like a 401k plan where you can exclude part-time employees. You can't do that with a 403B. You can only use this hours rule to essentially exclude them. Now, it's really important to understand how that 20-hour exclusion works, because unfortunately, it's not applied correctly a lot of times. And this is where sponsors end up with issues where somebody who was eligible wasn't allowed to contribute, and then they have to go back and make that up, or they were taken out of the plan erroneously because their hours dropped. So want to make sure everyone is really clear about how this hours exclusion works. So essentially, if you hire somebody that you do not expect to work more than 20 hours, or you expect them to work less than 20 hours a week, I should say, you can exclude them from the plan. So you don't offer them the plan initially, but you have to track that. So if somebody you hire part-time that is working, say, scheduled to do 10 to 15, but all of a sudden over the year, they end up getting a lot more time and they break through 1,000 hours either in their first anniversary 12 months or every plan year thereafter, then you have to let them enter the plan And that could also be for employer contributions, potentially if you have a 1 year, 1,000-hour requirement for your employer contributions. So this hours exclusion, if you apply it, you just have to make sure you're tracking hours, because if somebody does ever cross over, that essentially what equates to 1,000 hours, you have to let them enter the plan. So the other thing that kind of goes hand in hand with this is what's called the once in, always in rule. And there's just recently, there was another release on this, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But there's been, again, a lot of confusion about this and how it applies. And to the point where actually back in 2015, the IRS sent another clarification on this and still found plan sponsors weren't following it correctly. So in a nutshell, if somebody, and think of it as like a gateway. So if somebody becomes eligible in your plan, they go through that eligibility gateway, that gateway closes and they can't go back through it. Just think of it that way. So once somebody becomes eligible, your plan says they're eligible. It does not say that if they ever change their status to, say, part-time, where they're working less hours, that they're not going to become eligible. And what happened was, going back to that previous slide, a lot of sponsors took this guidance of the 20-hour rule in two parts. They thought it was, okay, well, I didn't hire them to work 20 hours, and then you're telling me I have to count hours. But if they go below that, the interpretation was then they're no longer eligible. But again, with the once in, always in rule, that's not the case. If I become eligible, then I'm always eligible. So a situation I had recently was an employer had somebody who was going to retire, and they were going to do a phased retirement. They went to part-time. The sponsor told them they could no longer contribute because they were under 20 hours, took them out of the plan. About 6 months went by. It came back to the surface. Should we have done this? The answer was no. And they had a match contribution as well. So they had to go back, reinstate him, and actually make up for those time plus earnings that were missed for his contribution in the match. So you want to be very careful that you apply this rule correctly, because you don't want to have to make up for any lost earnings that may occur for something like that. And again, what we have here too on the slide is the relief. So in essentially around 2018, 2019, the IRS said, listen, we're going to provide relief on 403B plans regarding this rule all the way back to when those 403B regs were passed. And that's all the way through the end of 2019. So if you haven't been applying the rule correctly, then you have a free pass, but no longer a free pass going forward. So you want to make sure you're really mindful of this because any relief has now gone away, and it's going to be monitored closely. So when you're administering a retirement plan, and again, this 403B and 401k plans alike, there's a couple administrative pitfalls we see quite a bit. And again, I wanted to point them out because if these things can be avoided, it saves you time and money for the corrections that may need to take place if you don't follow these rules specifically. And what we're talking about here is remitting contributions timely and consistently. And I think there's a lot of confusion out there on this, because the first bullet you'll see, that's actually from the IRS website. So a lot of people interpret that as, all right, well, if it's saying I have 15 days into the following month to make contributions, then I have that time to make those contributions. But really, the important part of this statement is early state that they can be reasonably segregated from the employer's general assets. So it's not necessarily that 15th business day from after the following month. It's that reasonably segregated language that we have to follow. And so what we advise our clients, and what I advise all of you to do, is if you're making the contribution, you're taking the payroll, say on a Thursday, and you're making contributions on that Friday, and you're doing that consistently every 2 weeks or every week or whenever you do payroll, try to be consistent with that. Because as soon as you show a pattern of what's administratively feasible for your organization, you've kind of set the standard for yourself. So any variance of that could lead to more scrutiny, red flags, and potential issues under audit. Now, for a small plan, there is a safe harbor, and this is fewer than 100 participants, where you have up to 7 business days to make the contribution. That's from the date that the contributions were withheld from the employee wages. So if you're over 100, there's not necessarily a safe harbor for you. It's really, and I think for all size organizations, I think it comes down to just making sure you're consistent with this, because this is one of the things that under audit they're looking at to see how you're doing that, and any variations could lead to more discussion there. One thing to think about there is having a backup. So if you have somebody who typically does your payroll and is trained to do it with the record keeper, the file, how to do it all, you should have somebody, I think, there that also knows how to do that in case that person on vacation, sick, whatever it is, somebody can jump in and make sure there's no change in how that payroll is going in. And you'll see here, 1/3 of investigations right now involve the remittance of late employee contributions. So this is a common issue, and again, one that they're really focusing in on. The other issues we see commonly is, and this is really following the plan document, understanding how your plan document's written and how to interpret that to administratively and how you're operating the plan. But one of the most common issues is failure to follow the definition of compensation. So I would encourage all of you, if nothing else, in your plan document, read what your definition of compensation is. Is it W-2 income? Is it something else? More importantly, though, are there any compensation exclusions? You know, do you include overtime? Do you exclude overtime, bonuses, whatever it may be, understanding all of that. And sometimes it could be where you include it for one type of contribution and you don't for another. So you want to make sure you're looking at how it applies even across the different types of contributions you're making. Then you have what's called pre-entry and post-severance compensation. So for pre-entry, do you include compensation before someone becomes eligible? So including the whole plan year, or do you only include it once they become eligible? Again, if you don't know that and you're applying a contribution, it could be incorrect, and you have to go back and make those corrections. Post-severance, and I'm not talking about severance pay, I'm talking about maybe it's unused leave or vacation time, whatever it is, anything that they would have earned if they were still working for you, typically is part of your post-severance compensation, unless you have any exclusions there. So you want to, again, make sure you know exactly what that is, because this is, again, where we find most of the failures. And then another couple here that we see is, especially under the 403B side, it's the failure to enroll somebody immediately. So one of the other things about universal availability is a 403B plan in terms of elective deferral. There is no eligibility period. It's always going to be immediate. All 403B plans have to comply with that. Where a 401k can say, hey, you have to be here 3 months, 6 months, a year before you start contributing, where a 403B cannot do that. But with the hours requirement, in some cases, it's not being tracked. Someone crosses over, they're not notified that they're eligible. And if that comes to light and they say, hey, I should have been in 6 months ago, you're on the hook for making that up for them. So you, again, want to make sure you're getting people in and letting them know they have the eligibility to enroll when they do. So tracking hours, again, the once in, always in rule. So now that you understand that, that's, again, one we see come up. I probably get 6 calls a year, if not more, about this. But one that, again, I think is something you want to be mindful of. And one last thing, especially from an HR perspective, make sure when someone's eligible that they have all the plan information. And I know that's being done in various different ways, paper forms, leading them to a website, whatever it may be, but just make sure they have that list of information, whether it be enrollment forms, an enrollment guide, the summary plan description. You want to make sure they have a copy of that, or they know where to get a copy of that. The QDIA, if you have a qualified default, they should have that notice, fee disclosure, and all other required forms that are based on your plan design. So things like auto enroll and things are unique, safe harbor, that are going to be more unique to your plan. But it's really important to make sure all of that information is provided to all of your newly eligible employees in a timely manner. The other things you want to be mindful of here are, and we see, are errors in match and calculating match or employer contributions. The other thing is vesting. So one thing we talk about a lot is your plan hours or elapsed time based. So if you're looking at your vesting, you want to make sure you know what that is, because if it's hours, of course, it's based on hours earned in each plan year, where elapsed time, it's just a period of time that they've that they've accomplished. So very different in how you look at that. And then in-service distribution. So being careful, if you are approving a hardship, do you have the proper documentation? I know we all want to trust our employees and get whatever they need financially as quickly as possible, but you're putting yourself at risk if you're not getting proper documentation. And loans, similar in terms of if you are approving loans, making sure that you are looking at the loan, making sure they're not borrowing more than they can, not exceeding any loan maximums that you have. So those do provide or require some administrative oversight that you want to be careful about. So with all of that said, and so far all we've talked about is more of the administrative side of things. Is when you offer a retirement plan as a sponsor, you're expected to follow the prudent man standard. In a nutshell, you're deemed an expert and you are responsible for essentially making decisions on things that you may not feel that you are an expert in. So whether it's making decisions on investments, reviewing different providers, making decisions on your plan design, whatever it may be, you're expected to not only be prudent, but also follow a prudent process. So it's important to, kind of recognize that. And I'm sure, I'm not going to poll the audience today, but I'm sure most of us that are sitting on this meeting are a fiduciary in some capacity to our plan. So a fiduciary is liable, not only the corporate, but the individual is liable for any decisions that are being made and any action that's taken. So you want to make sure that not only you recognizing that, but how are you insulating yourself against that liability? And so you want to make sure you implement a sound risk management process. And a lot of this comes down to process. Just like anything else in your business, you want to make sure you have a process in place, that you're following that process and you're documenting that process. And obviously that's how you prove you're following it. Because again, it's not about having the best mutual fund. It's not about having the lowest cost provider. It's showing that you went through a prudent process to come to that decision. So everything we're going to talk about is about putting that process in place and following it. So first and foremost, and I think this is probably pretty obvious for all of us, is that you want to hire professionals to help you with this. So the most obvious is a record keeper. You guys are not doing the record keeping of your retirement plans in-house. You recognize that you have to hire somebody because you don't have the time or capacity to do that. So we hire professionals to do the work for us to help us with our plan. But more so on the fiduciary side, making sure you're aligned with either a 321 or a 338 investment fiduciary. So this is the 321 and 338, both are in regards to the investment management. So again, if you sponsor a retirement plan, ultimately you're responsible for the choices you are giving your participants in the plan to choose from. So essentially the menu that's created, you are on the hook for those decisions. So if an investment over time is underperforming and it's not being monitored and a participant makes a claim, they may have a valid claim to make. So you want to, again, make sure that if you're not taking on the work of selecting, monitoring, and replacing your investments, you want to align yourself with an advisor that will do that for you. And a 321 or a 338, they are going to act in a co-fiduciary capacity with you. So they're going to share in some of that liability. The difference is a 321 is just advice. So no discretion, meaning when a decision needs to be made, it's a committee decision. The advisor might be there to guide you, but they're not necessarily making the decision for you. 338, on the other hand, would be full management or discretion. So they're not only monitoring, but when it comes time to make changes, they're implementing those changes and just notifying you of that. So a 338 certainly is a higher standard because they're taking that discretion than a 321. And then lastly, on the administration side, there's now this emergence, and it's been there, but more and more you're hearing about is a 316 administrator, a fiduciary administrator. So this is somebody that would actually be a co-fiduciary in regards to the administration of your plan. So dealing with distributions, for example, participant notices, which you guys know very well, that there's so many notices that you have to send out every year. So a lot of these 316 relationships, they will take that on for you. So it's essentially another new level of administration co-fiduciary that you can take advantage of in your plan. So this is a way to very clearly shift some of that liability. But remember that you're still the fiduciary of the plan. So no matter how you align yourself with professionals and in some cases co-fiduciaries, just realize that you're not ever shifting that liability completely away, even in a 338, because you're responsible for monitoring these fiduciaries to make sure that they're fulfilling their obligations and all of the contracts that they've set up for you, that they're actually doing what they're supposed to do and at a reasonable fee. So there is some oversight here where you still have that fiduciary role. Now, as I mentioned, outsourcing administration. So this is, I think, really important, especially in the groups we work with in the nonprofit sector, where we're not dealing with HR departments that are 4, 5, 6 people deep. It's usually 1, 2, 3 people running the department. So in some cases less. So this is an opportunity for you to outsource some of that day-to-day administration, and in some cases actually have a 316 fiduciary take that on for you. So this essentially would be a TPA or third-party administrator or your record keeper assuming the responsibility of these tasks in a co-fiduciary way. So again, I mentioned participant mailings, the annual mailings. There's tons of those things that you need to send out. Fee disclosure, QDIA. They're all on a time status, so you have to get them out at specific times during the year. So it'd be a way for you to kind of outsource that and not have to deal with it yourself. So something to think about in your current arrangements if you're taking advantage of this type of 316 arrangement, and if not, maybe something to look into. Now, as a plan committee, one thing you want to do is think about a committee charter. The reason why this is important is because most plans, if you look at your plan document, the plan sponsor is typically named as the organization. The plan administrator typically named as the organization. Not always. Sometimes you might have a specific person named. If you're working with a 316 administrator, the 316 could be named as your plan administrator because of that role. But most often than not, it is the corporation or organization that's named as the plan administrator, plan sponsor, which means the organization now is the fiduciary or the board is the fiduciary because they're ultimately making the decisions. So the charter would allow you to delegate that fiduciary role to your committee, because I'm sure most of you operate under a committee. You might have your HR, CFO, COO, whoever it may be as your group that is your retirement plan committee, maybe some board members, but you want to formally document that those folks are taking on that role where the board is delegating that fiduciary role to that committee. So that's something that you should be thinking about. And you can do that through the charter, but also board resolution, and you can just have a process where people sign on and resign to the committee on an annual basis. But this should be documented. The other thing you should always have is your investment policy statement. This is what governs your investment process. So in terms of selecting investments, how you monitor investments, and when managers may need to be replaced. This should tie back to your investment review process so that it's all one cohesive process, and the investment monitoring is adhering to your investment policy statement mandates. But this is important because when the Department of Labor comes in, if they should ever audit you, they're not going to necessarily, again, look at the performance of your individual funds to determine whether or not you're doing a good job. They're going to want to look at whether you have that process. And that process is going to be based on your investment policy statement being in place, and then all of the documentation of your investment reviews that you've been conducting that all tie back to your investment policy statement mandates. So you want to make sure you have this in place to show, again, that process is in place for handling your fiduciary obligations for the investments. And then another thing that's emerged more recently with Department of Labor audits that we're hearing more and more about is the fact that your committee should have fiduciary training and it should be documented. So, we sometimes we start engaging with a committee and just a question, do you know you're a fiduciary? Do you know what that means? Do you know you're personally liable? Do you know what your responsibilities are? You might have some that are very clear and some that may not. So this training is important to make sure everybody understands what this means to be on that committee and taking that fiduciary role. And again, as I mentioned, having this training, implementing the training and documenting it, it will meet those Department of Labor expectations. So again, highly recommend you have some kind of training modules in place, whether it be the existing committee or when folks change, having that training in place to satisfy these requirements. And again, to have a committee that's aware of what those responsibilities are and are making sure that they're fulfilling them. And then, of course, in terms of how do we create the process, so we have the charter, making sure we have our named committee fiduciaries, we have our investment policy statement in place, and then we want to make sure we have our cadence of what we're doing every year, so that we're again fulfilling our fiduciary duties and making and documenting that we've done what we're supposed to do every year. So what are some of those things that we want to focus on? Well, one is the investment management, and we would recommend having a quarterly investment review. Whether you meet every quarter, I think is up to the committee and time constraints and really all of that. But at the end of the day, you should have a report that tracks every investment on a quarterly basis. And you are meeting at least once a year to discuss any action items that need to be discussed in your investment platform. The other part of that is the annual fiduciary review. And this could be to discuss various topics that relate to the fiduciary, or it could be part of that training process that we talked about earlier. This is a great opportunity to get outside of just the investments and talk a little bit more about some of those other tasks that need to be completed that the fiduciaries have that responsibility for. So we want to make sure we have that in place as well. Another real important part of the plan maintenance and responsibility is the annual fee review. So we would recommend that once a year you have not just an outline of your fees, which is important because you want to know how fees are paid and what those fees are, but I think it's important to benchmark those fees as well to see, is our plan still competitively priced based on plans of similar size? Because your plan's going to change. It's going to grow over time, especially in the last couple of years. We've had some tremendous growth in the stock market. So if you've seen plan assets grow and you haven't seen that type of fee benchmarking, you could find that, hey, our plan is going to the point where maybe we need to start looking at fee reductions or possibly even looking at other providers if that's not the case. The other, in addition to this, not on the screen, would be the actual full. And this annual fee review is typically based on averages, so kind of a benchmark of plan averages. Whereas every 3 to 5 years, we would suggest taking your plan out to market as well, doing a full RFP. Even if your intention isn't to move the plan, again, it's a great fiduciary process to have in your file to show that your fees have been benchmarked. And again, if determined, the fees are reasonable for the services being provided in the investment opportunities that are available to us. That's what the Department of Labor, again, wants to see. That there's no roadmap necessarily that they draft for us on all of this stuff. They just want you to follow a prudent process. And that's one of the prudent processes that we would highly recommend to have in your file, because it shows that you have done your due diligence. And it doesn't mean you're always intending to move the plan. It could be just to show that that was done, but also hopefully the result is you have your current incumbent provider maybe sharpen their pencil a little bit and provide you some discounts if the plan has grown a little bit there. So it's the process, but also the results of that could be better outcomes. And then lastly, the plan demographic review. So this is what we call our plan health review. And this is a lot of times when we're looking at what's the participation rate, what's the deferral rate, are we hitting the metrics that we'd like to hit? What can we do, whether it be education for participants, maybe it's a discussion around plan design. We're just not necessarily getting to where we want to. Maybe we need to look at our plan design to try to achieve those goals that we have for the plan. So this is another part of the review process every year, is looking at your plan health and strategizing on how to get your employees to a comfortable retirement. Everything should be documented. So any meeting you should have meeting minutes. Those meeting minutes should, again, have the attendees, the issues, any decisions that you've made, and action items. So again, as simple as that sounds, if you don't document it, it didn't happen. And again, for our side of things, these meeting minutes are critical because, when we look back quarter to quarter, we have our action items and we make sure that we're staying on track with anything that we're trying to accomplish, whether it be a fund change, an investment or a plan design change, employee education. It's really important to have those minutes to track progress. But at the end of the day, part of your fiduciary file should include all of this. So whether it be the reports, the meeting minutes, everything should be put into a file and retained. And again, what we find is when our clients are doing their annual audit with their CPA, they want all the meeting minutes, boom, it's all there for them to download and give to their clients. And then under an actual government audit, that's going to be key. Again, showing that process, showing that you have the documentation of that process that you've been following. So this is all should be put into that briefcase for those reasons. And then because you guys are taking that fiduciary role, we would also recommend thinking about fiduciary insurance if you haven't already. This is not your ERISA or Fidelity bond. This is beyond that. It really protects the committee members that are taking on that fiduciary liability. So again, this could be something that offers additional layers of protection beyond just having your process, which hopefully should provide the insulation that you need, but this would just provide that additional protection through the insurance. So just shifting gears into our last couple of slides here is, talking a little bit about plan design. And, I mentioned a little bit about the plan health report that we usually look at on an annual basis with our clients. That again helps us measure the plan, again, typically plan participation, contribution rate, and also how close are they getting to their appropriate income replacement goal for retirement. And that's something that helps us base those conversations on some plan design changes occasionally. And I think a lot of that comes down to what you're trying to accomplish. I find so often where we start talking about plan design, going through a plan document, and some of the provisions, the committee's like, I'm not sure why that's in there. That was there when I came on board. It may have been something that we were trying to accomplish years ago. It's not necessarily applicable anymore. So you want to make sure, and I know the 403B plan restatement period was not too long ago, so hopefully you took advantage of that, to go through your plan to make sure it truly is creating the outcomes that you want. So, looking at eligibility, again, a lot of times, not on the 403B side, but certainly on the 401k side, there's a 1-year eligibility wait. So for deferrals. So the question is, well, why are you making people wait to contribute their own money into retirement? Understand you might want to have them wait a year for employer, but maybe it makes sense to have that be 60 days or 90 days so they can start contributing sooner. So we're seeing a lot of that happening in terms of eligibility. Going to a matching contribution to help incentivize people to save, stretching that match formula. So if today I'm matching 100% on 2, well, why not do 50% on 4? Still the same amount that I have to contribute, but now I've raised the bar. So hopefully participants are putting in 4%, still giving them a 2, but now the total is 6 versus what it was prior, which would have been 4. And the reality is, if you match to 2, most people are going to put in 2. If you match to 4, they're going to try to put in 4. So that matching formula you can use to try to increase the deferral percentage in the plan. And then the other thing we're seeing more and more of is the consideration of automatic enrollment. And again, it's slowly becoming more and more prevalent in smaller plans. Certainly on the large plan size, there's a much larger take-up rate. But all I'll say about automatic enrollment is if it's something you are considering, the one thing we do find is participants don't typically opt out. And I know that's usually The biggest fear is we're overreaching, we're putting somebody or making a decision for somebody that they may not otherwise want to do. But what we find is a lot of people don't opt out. In fact, a lot of times, if they are going in there to make a change to the auto enrollment, they're increasing it or really just adjusting it to what they want to do. But it's at least giving them that over the hurdle of enrolling, which is the biggest hurdle that we all face, is actually taking the step to get into the plan, making all of those tough decisions that you need to make. So auto enrollment, auto escalation certainly has become more and more prevalent. And that really is to drive these participant outcomes, to have folks ready to retire on track, because the realization that the longer these folks stay, they do become more expensive for us. So there is a motivation there from a lot of organizations to try to design their plan so that folks do have the best shot at retiring on track. So again, courageous plan design. So things like I mentioned, automatic enrollment, looking at a stretch match, auto escalation, which a lot of times goes with automatic enrollment. Things like that can make significant differences to your plan, and again, create that outcome that you're looking for. So I definitely want to encourage all of you to do that. Just take a look at your plan, take a step back. We'd be happy to review the plan with you as well to provide some guidance. But again, make sure your plan is doing what you want it to do. And if not, talk to your plan document provider or your advisor about designing a plan that's going to have the impact that you're looking for. So I know that was a lot of information. Again, I'm hoping you took something from this, but I definitely want to pause here and see if there's any questions that I could answer. And again, even if it's not something we mentioned today, I'd say all questions are fair game.
Hey, Matt, it's Steph.
Hey, Steph.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. This was extremely, extremely helpful. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah, I look forward to some follow-up conversations with you on a couple of things. So I have two quick questions for you, and it goes back to the eligibility piece that you talked about early on. Mm-hmm. That once in, always in piece. Can you talk about how that would apply to rehires?
Yeah, so a lot of times if you do rehire somebody, they're eligible right away, most often than not.
Okay, so if somebody leaves employment and they are eligible when they've left employment, and then they're rehired into a category that would not be eligible, for example, as a per diem, should we assume that they are still eligible?
I would assume they're still eligible, and I would definitely talk to your document provider or your advisor just to make sure, but that sounds like somebody who would be eligible still.
Okay, perfect. Okay. And then the second one is the hours piece, which is always the bane of any plan administrator's existence. Mm-hmm. So again, going back to that person who is employed to work under 20 hours, that first service. So just trying to make sure we're tracking hours correctly.
Yep.
Let's say like the first time frame we're looking at is their first anniversary year, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then if after the first anniversary year, they do not hit the 1,000 hour threshold, are we thereafter looking at our plan year, which could be the next measurement period is going to be, say, for example, for us, 10/1 to 9/30?
Yeah. So Stephanie, I have the benefit of knowing your document. So the answer is yes. Okay. I would say 99% of the time it is going to be plan year thereafter you're tracking, because it obviously makes it easier to have everybody in that plan year versus all these different anniversary dates that you'd have to be tracking. So outside of it be anniversary to anniversary, if your plan states that, I would say, again, most often than not, it's going to be the plan year thereafter.
Excellent. All right. Thank you.
You bet. Any other questions? So my contact information is there too. So if you hesitate to ask the question with the group and you want to reach out to me after the fact, please do. Be happy to help in any way, answer questions, whatever it may be. And I know Rollin echoes the same, that we're here to help if you guys want to reach out. So.
Hey, Matt, great job. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with everybody. As a committee, if you folks have other topics that you'd like us to address, please let Andrea know, and we will follow through with that. So this came this topic was an actual request from the committee here. So happy to support all of your efforts. Thanks for joining us today. And if there's no further questions, I'm headed into my third Zoom meeting for the day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank
All
you
right.
both.
I will post the recording of this call to our YouTube channel and send it out to the council. Is it possible to get a copy of the slides, Matt?
I'll send it to you. Yep.
Thank you. All right, great. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks,
All right.
Andrea.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.